Hey guys, this is your High Fist here with another juicy video. As always, I've done it, guys. I've managed to sit myself down again. I did throw down the gauntlet, so to speak, in my previous video and encourage my fellow Malas tubers to start posting content again so that we could ease the burden of the two doctors. And I've given them 2 weeks to do it, but all I've been met with is stunning silence, guys. Nobody has posted shit. I know what you guys are thinking. How dare they? How dare they refuse, even when their high fist calls as banners? But you know what, guys? Sometimes we must build before they come. So get ready for a Ruth and Bad one-man rampage this month, particularly with this month presenting the 1 year anniversary of the Ruth and Bad channel. So if things go to plan, expect a lot of videos in the next few weeks. As our beloved chairman Mao Zedong once said, bombard the headquarters. And that's what we'll be doing. I will be analyzing the pans of the 10 big books, and I will be going in balls deep. So the community tab is also finally open, as those of you who saw the poll would have realized. And the results of the first ever Ruth and Bat poll are out. As you guys know or don't, 3 is my favorite number. So today's video and the winner of the poll is the topic that got the third most votes: Eriksonian humanism versus Randian objectivism, as in Steven Erikson versus Ayn Rand. This will also be one of those extremely rare, spoiler-free discussion videos on this channel because I think it's a larger literary conversation. So let's get it started. As always, thank you to Steven Erikson for sharing and commenting on my last video. This topic is something I said I would do almost a year ago when I did my George Orwell Chaos Invictad analysis. And I said that because Erikson left behind an unforgettable comment for that video. As you guys know, back in the ancient and early days of Malaztube, before Malaztube was sundered by YouTube controversy, back then there was a tremendous amount of intellectual discussion going back and forth between him and his fans from many different continents, I might add. And this was one of the best comments. He had some interesting observations about Ayn Rand and her philosophy of objectivist libertarianism. I guess objectivism would be more accurate. He fired some live ammunition. And this is what Erikson said. I'm pulling out my notes. So he said, and I'm kind of quoting here, the most concrete expression of the tyranny of certainty to be found in fiction is Ayn Rand. I repeat, quote, the most concrete expression of the tyranny of certainty to be found in fiction is Ayn Rand, end quote. As in, the most ideologically fanatical, the most ideologically rigid example to be found in all of fiction is Ayn Rand. So he's not exactly being opaque about his opinion here. Steven Erikson does not seem to be a big fan of Ayn Rand's fiction. And that is what we will be discussing in today's video. We will be contrasting Steven Erikson and Ayn Rand. I think there are two major areas in which they are polar opposites of each other. The first is the element of certainty, which Erikson touched on in that quote, which the quote was referring to it. And the second is the pursuit of self-interest, which Ayn Rand sees as the ultimate virtue and Steven Erikson tends to see as the ultimate sin. Before I go further, let me make a disclaimer for the sake of all the Ayn Rand fans out there who might be watching this. I'm a big fan and admirer of Ayn Rand. I really am. A sizable chunk of my 20s was spent as a libertarian, and a big part of that was the power of her ideas. She was an extraordinary human being, and I still think it's a shame that the feminist movement, despite successive waves of feminism, still doesn't seem to have reconciled her place in the pantheon, and she still doesn't seem to have been embraced by them. The reason I say this is a shame is because she's one of the few women who can legitimately say that she was the most influential philosopher of modern times. I mean, think about it. Atlas Shrugged by itself is one of the best selling novels of all time. No other major philosopher of the last 300 years has achieved what she did, which is create a work of fiction that was not only a mega bestseller on par with the Bible and Shakespeare and all that, but that this also embodied her philosophy and where her ideology was the star rather than the plot or the characters of the book. Nobody praises Atlas Shrugged for the prose or for Rand's selection of words. It's all about her philosophy being portrayed through a fictional story. You can run through the big names in Western philosophy. How many have achieved this? Did Nietzsche, did Schopenhauer, did Immanuel Kant, did Karl Marx? None of them achieved what she did. Of course, the novels themselves are unreadable because of this, because they come off as ideology and not as entertaining stories. But the success of her work speaks for itself. Regardless of what you and I think, she has millions of fans around the world to this day, even 40 years after her death. So we can't take that away from her. So now that you know how I feel about the importance of respecting her, let me join my boy Erikson on this side of the fence and critique her work from an Eriksonian perspective. For starters, I think we need to acknowledge that there's a certain similarity between the two, in the sense that Erikson has achieved what I just credited Ayn Rand for, other than, of course, the worldwide best selling stuff, right? But the Malazan books are also fiction that deeply convey the worldview and the philosophy of the person writing it, even though that might not have been the overt objective. And this philosophy is what I've referred to in earlier videos as Eriksonian humanism. You often find people using the term compassion and empathy while talking about the Malazan books. And this is what Eriksonian humanism means. The idea that regardless of where people are on the moral spectrum, from the most innocent children to the most despicable mass murdering tyrants, that they all deserve compassion and empathy. Or the idea that no matter where you are on the power spectrum, from the crippled beggars to gods who can destroy worlds, that they all deserve compassion and empathy. This is the crux of Eriksonian humanism. And much like how Ayn Rand's fiction is shaped by the values she's trying to promote, the Malazan story is shaped by some of these lessons and values that Erikson is trying to highlight. But that's where the similarities end. After all, Ayn Rand and Steven Erikson are mirror versions of each other. To be more precise, Atlas Shrugged and The Fountainhead are mirror versions of the Malazan Book of the Fallen. So let's look at the first difference that I highlighted earlier, the element of uncertainty. As Erikson pointed out in that quote, there's a sense of unshakable certainty in Ayn Rand's work, certainty in the inherent value of the ideology that's being promoted, certainty in the intellectual and moral superiority of the ideology that's being promoted, certainty in an objective singular reality. The 10 books, on the other hand, as we all know, are the opposite. It's all about how you can never be certain. You can never be sure. And this is why I think he describes her work as embodying the tyranny, the quote, the tyranny of certainty. Because in Erikson's universe and philosophy, the imposition of certainty, the forced imposition of any kind of certainty, moral, social, ideological, whatever, that forced imposition of certainty is the most tyrannical act possible. And we see that both in his writing style and in his stories, as in, we see this aversion towards the imposition of certainty both in his craft and in his art. Let me explain. The Malazan books narratively are all about uncertainty. Consider the famous unreliable narrator that embodies this. Even when we are in someone's mind as readers, even when watching the story from a character's perspective, even then we cannot trust them as sources because they themselves could be mistaken or deceived, or in some cases, just outright liars. Erikson also keeps the timeline consistent but loose in terms of what happens when, which once again liberates the reader from this tyranny of uncertainty, from this tyranny of a fixed chronology. I've discussed this idea of a loose historical chronology in my video on Erikson's political views, so you can check that out. Something else that he does is constantly play around with who the antagonists and who the protagonists are. Characters we think are despicable transition into fan favorites. Characters we think are the good guys often turn out to be the bad guys. I can go into an entire list, but I want to keep this spoiler free, as I was saying. So, I mean, I know that those of you who finished the 10 big books know exactly what I'm talking about how we can never be certain about where any of these characters stand. Even with the magic system, the one area where certainty is usually expected, Erikson delivers something open to interpretation. By the end of the 10 books, you will know what the Warrens are and how they work, but you will know only as much as the people in the story because they themselves have different versions. We get the perspectives of multiple users of magic in the series, and almost all of them have different interpretations of how the magic system works. And while we do see certain similarities and patterns for us to carve out our own understanding of how the Warrens work, it's still kept open enough to where we could encounter a new character in a new book tomorrow and we would find out that everything we knew was wrong and it would still be consistent with whatever we were told. None of these writing techniques would be possible in Ayn Rand's approach to fiction because in her tradition, you cannot have an unreliable narrator. You can't have fluid chronology. You certainly cannot have moral ambiguity because there has to be one version of the reality being portrayed in an Ayn Rand novel. In the Malazan books, let's say we get an internal monologue that says, X happened 2 years ago. There's no guarantee that X ever happened. In fact, we might find out 9 books later that it was not X but Y that happened. And it wasn't 2 years ago. Guess what? It was 2 million years ago that it happened. That's Malazan. With Ayn Rand's work, on the other hand, if you hear that X happened 2 years ago, then as a reader, you know that X happened 2 years ago. Another problem of certainty is in terms of moral superiority. Ayn Rand's work was essentially about the superiority of her ideology over the others. Erikson's work is essentially about the dangers of believing in the superiority of your ideology over the others. See where I'm going with this? Every character who pays a heavy price in the 10 big books believed a little too deeply and with too much certainty in some cause. Every character who gets redemption in the series is someone whose mind is liberated in some way after being trapped in a singular way of thinking. We rarely see a battle without us seeing the rationale of both sides. And the major mistakes that a lot of characters make in the series is because of their inability to be open-minded about other possibilities. Just as how Ayn Rand's work is a great case study on how to construct ideology, I would say Steven Erikson's work is a great case study on how to deconstruct ideology. And just as how her work is a great argument, sort of, that is put forward through a work of fiction, Steven Erikson's books are an equally powerful argument for why everybody has a strong argument and for why absolute certainty exists for all of us from our own vantage points. So all of this is the contrast between the two on issues of certainty. Let's look at the second difference between the two, which I believe is the more important one, which is the idea of self-interest as a virtue. Not only did Ayn Rand believe that we must all pursue self-interest as a moral duty, that it was a virtue, a good thing. There was also a certain cynicism she had about concepts like charity, sacrifice, martyrdom, and so on. And of course, these are the very traits that are celebrated in the Malazan books as the kind of ultimate demonstrations of how good a person is. In fact, if I was to give you a spoiler free synopsis of the Malazan Book of the Fallen in a nutshell, here it is. So listen closely. And I'm doing this because I want you to see just how important the twin themes of selfishness and selflessness are to this story. So here's the synopsis. The gods have done something selfish. We don't quite know what it is until the final book, but they've done something selfish. The world is now on the verge of destruction because of this selfishness. And ordinary mortals are now required to make incredible sacrifices to display far more courage and selflessness than the gods themselves in order to save the world. So everything we read in the 10 big books is tied in some way to one of these two strands. It's either tied into the selfishness of the gods or the selflessness that is now required to rectify the problem. And that's the story. All subplots are either about why it's bad to be selfish or why it's good to be selfless. And that's what I meant when I said earlier that in Erikson's universe, selfishness is the ultimate sin, because that's what all 10 books are about. And this principle even works on a cosmic level. Many of the gods are forced to deal with the regret of having done this selfish act. In that sense, the overall moral itself of the Malazan story is that you can be a god, but you will still have to deal with the repercussions of your own selfishness and the selfishness of others as well. So just look at what a huge contrast that is, right? Here you have a story where the gods themselves are made to regret being selfish, while on the Ayn Rand side, even ordinary mortals are encouraged to be selfish and are told that this is an ethical act in order to create an ideal society. The Malazan books are a morality tale on the dangers of selfishness. The Ayn Rand books are arguments in favor of this. We can make a similar analogy when we look at the major kingdoms and civilizations of the Malazan world. In the Eriksonian universe, the pursuit of self-interest is now driving these societies to self-destruction because of their own greed. Whether it's the Malazan Empire's greed for territory or the Lethari Empire's greed for resources, they've all become these over-exploitative kingdoms bursting at the seams, where on the outside they look really rich and prosperous, but on the inside, all of these societies have grave existential problems. And this is symbolized even stronger when one of the rulers of one of these empires becomes this immortal king who's indestructible on the outside, but his soul is being tortured and he's constantly screaming on the inside. From a Randian perspective, some of these societies should be thriving because they are so devoted to the pursuit of self-interest. But in the Eriksonian perspective, that attitude is leading to the destruction of all these societies. In fact, I think it would be fair to say that in Erikson's perspective, this type of libertarian society, and really any type of libertarian society, would not be possible in the real world because it would eat itself up. It would be doomed from the get-go. For example, one of the modern criticisms of Ayn Rand's work is that she doesn't consider what the impact of her self-interest based society would be on the environment. Erikson answers this in many of his books, particularly in Midnight Tides and in Reaper's Gale, both of which have very powerful environmental messages. And he shows how it's the endless and irresponsible consuming that leads to this, because the pursuit of self-interest without any moral obligations to check those self-interests can only lead to destruction. So these are the two fundamental and irreconcilable differences between Ayn Rand's approach to fiction and Steven Erikson's approach to fiction. And I think I'm right to use the word irreconcilable because they're just too far apart. As I've stated in some of my other videos before, Erikson's philosophy draws a lot of inspiration from Eastern and tribal ways of looking at the world. And as I've also mentioned before, one of the major differences in the religious traditions and the intellectual traditions of the West and the East is that the Western monotheistic traditions often insist on objective truth, as in we have a holy book. Whatever is in this book is the truth. Whatever contradicts this book is false. The Eastern tradition, on the other hand, relies on accepting a multiplicity of truths. It accepts many different ways in which you realize the truth, and there's no sense of certainty, as in there's no insistence that what is being said is unquestionable. So if we were to use this dichotomy as a crude analogy for our video's purposes, Ayn Rand would be more along the monotheistic tradition where there's a conviction and there's an insistence on the readers adopting this conviction as well. Erikson is more along the lines of Hinduism or Buddhism, where we are bombarded with thousands of stories. These stories sometimes have nothing to do with each other. Some of the stories that might blow my mind might seem boring to you. Some stories that might change your entire outlook on life might seem boring to me. His work is more along that tradition. And the final point I'd like to make as my concluding remark is that ultimately Ayn Rand's sympathies lie with the strong and Erikson's sympathies lie with the weak. When Rand was once interviewed about Atlas Shrugged, she said, and I quote, she said she wrote it to, quote, to show how desperately the world needs prime movers and how viciously it treats them, close quote. And she also said that she wanted to show what would happen to the world if we didn't have them, if we didn't have the prime movers, the big achievers, the really talented people. So her work is basically all about the importance of treating the strong well, while Erikson's work is all about how the weak are being mistreated and how we must have some sort of empathy for this mistreatment, even if there's nothing that we can often do about it. So there you have it, guys, a comparison of Steven Erikson and Ayn Rand. I hope you found that somewhat interesting. I'll hopefully see you guys with another juicy video quite soon. So take care, guys.